We're back for part two of chapter 11 on advertising and public relations. I want to talk very briefly about some general types of advertising and make some comments about the status of advertising for those forms of media. When we think about advertising, a lot of us think of newspapers, for example. The commercial ads, which are the large display type ads that you find in a newspaper, anywhere from a quarter page all the way up to a full page, and classified advertising are both far down from what they were 10, 15 years ago. And although there's been a somewhat of an uptick in display advertising over the last several months, newspapers still are really not getting enough advertising to support them. Magazines are a little bit more in trouble, as we talked about when we actually talked about the magazine chapter. Their ads are down quite a bit, and it's going to take a recovery from some substantial financial sources from advertisers, both online and in print, in order for them to keep publishing. So this is why we sometimes worry that magazines may go totally online, or most of them may go online, and that they may not be published in print anymore. Radio is doing fairly well. It's cheaper to buy a radio ad, a commercial on the radio, often because they're sold in blocks instead of buying one big ad in a newspaper or a magazine, or maybe running a few ads in either one of those. In radio, the blocks are more frequent, so you might, for example, if you're running a political campaign, you might saturate the airwaves on radio with by buying 60 commercials all at once. And there'll be some production costs, and there may be even a couple different versions of the commercial. But because you're buying in bulk, or because the advertising is being sold to you in bulk, it's somewhat cheaper than buying something for print. Now, the other thing that you have going against you with radio, and to some extent with television, is that it's ephemeral. It's there and you hear it or you see it, and then it's gone. Whereas in print and magazines, the effective advertising tends to hang around a little bit longer. TV spots, when you see a commercial, that's actually called a spot. They're also sold in blocks. Infomercials, which are really a combination of a commercial and someone trying to sell you a product, so it's kind of a combination of advertising and public relations, are a little bit more expensive. But the other things that are going on in the world of advertising right now for television is just an awful lot of product placement. You see that in movies also, whether it's a certain brand of computer or a certain beer that's used on a show or in a movie. Sometimes advertisers simply pay for the advantage of having their product shown on screen without actually having a commercial being shown. One of the problems facing television right now is ad blocking, and that is the ability of a lot of newer technical devices to simply skip past commercials. And if you have a TV that's capable of doing that, then you probably, on one level, enjoy the programming a little bit more because you're able to skip most of the commercials. Or if you're watching something that you tape recorded or digitally recorded earlier, you can get to the real stuff faster. That's not good news for advertisers, however, who are paying for in the hope that you will see their commercials, their spots. Obviously, on mobile phones, there's now a lot of apps that include advertising that are advertising based. And one that the book didn't talk about, but is really important, is direct mail. All those postcards and letters and flyers that come to your house by post office actually are very cheap to produce, cheap to send, relatively speaking, and are very effective for getting results. And that's why you get deluged around political campaign times and certain times of the year, like if you need people that sell gutter cleaning and lawn mowing and stuff like that will kind of deluge your mailbox with that stuff, because it actually does, surveys show, as they say, that it does actually work pretty well. We're going to talk a little bit about advertising regulation because it's varied a lot over the years. I've got an illustration on this screen showing some patent medicines from, I think, the first part of the 20th century. The Pure Food and Drug Law of 1906 was intended to control patent medicines because at the time anybody could put anything they wanted to in a bottle and claimed it would solve your brain, basically heal cancer, solve your heart problems, do anything you might think of. And a lot of times these concoctions, they were often patented, but they really didn't display their true ingredients. A lot of them were just filled with alcohol and sort of various kinds of bitter spices and things like that. Some of them in the early days, in the late 19th century, actually contained products like cocaine and other drugs that were later found to be harmful. So, in fact, Coca-Cola, the drink, actually originally had some coca leaves as part of its brew, and so technically had cocaine in it, but it wasn't enough to really make people addicted. But there was a lot of rampant advertising going on for centuries, and particularly in the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. So there was an attempt by the U.S. government to try to bring that under control with this Pure Food and Drug Law to try to control that. The Federal Trade Commission was formed in 1914, started to take up the first round of a bunch of claims on false advertising. Again, people claiming that a lot of products, particularly these other things like patent medicines and food, would do things for you, would deliver better health for you, or make your life somehow substantially better. They followed that up way back in 1971 to have more of a penalty phase to these false claims. And that was the shorthand term for that particular act by the FTC was the Truth in Advertising laws. So they finally put some more teeth into the laws in 1971. A new concern arose, and that had to do with companies who were exploring getting email, or I should say IP addresses from people's computers, particularly children who were surfing for toys and things like that, and you were using it to try to steal that information to remarket back to children. So in 1998, the Children's Online Privacy Act was passed to prevent companies from stealing information from children's cookies. Now there are computers. Now there are still continuing concerns about the way the internet tracks your purchases and your personal interests. If you research an article on anything, it may surprise you that within days or hours even, you may suddenly start getting advertising requests on the internet to see if you want to buy those products. For example, I do a lot of my clothes shopping online. I find a pair of shoes I like, so unless it's a local homegrown business and I have to buy it at a box store, I'll go online to get a better price, and suddenly I'm inundated with advertising from that brand of shoes or that other clothing that I might look at. I'm sure you've experienced the same kind of thing, and it's kind of creepy in a way about whenever you do an internet search, a lot of times there's suddenly advertising companies are trying to sell you things based on that. A lot of times, just in the course of looking things up for this class, I will find information that is helpful and useful, and then within a few days I'll start getting emails about, don't you want to buy this product? It's totally unrelated to anything I want to buy. It's also very easy to get yourself signed up for store catalogs and things accidentally by clicking on a news site, and includes the fine print that's saying that you're requesting that company's services, and that's how a lot of us start getting junk mail both online and at home related to advertising. So this is a continuing problem, and with the digital age, it's changed. It's no longer a problem of making sure, not just a problem of making sure that products are safely advertised, correctly advertised, and that people can back up and support the claims that they're making in advertising. Now it's because of digital, it's become a more widespread problem and one harder to kind of corral. I'm going to talk about something that's difficult to talk about, and it may be difficult for you to see some of these images, but I think it's important to talk about the way in which advertising has created problems, stereotypes in one cases. So if you're offended by some of these ads, I apologize, but rather than just ignore the topic, I think I'd like to talk about this a little bit. So if you look at a lot of older advertising and some advertising that maybe isn't all that old, you will see a lot of stereotypes about black people, African Americans. And the example the book uses is the Aunt Jemima syrup products and Uncle Ben's rice. And so I found one for Aunt Jemima. It looks like it was done in the 40s, maybe. And it's the terminology is it's written in what would have been called in that day Negro dialect. And obviously, you show a stereotypical mammy figure talking in a stereotypical Negro dialect, and it's offensive. It was offensive to some people then, and it continues to be offensive. But it was pretty typical of a lot of advertising. And coupled with that was the fact that advertising has perpetuated stereotypes about women. And here's a Schlitz ad from, I'm guessing, the 50s, maybe the 40s also, in which the poor housewife who burns her dinner because she's totally incompetent, we know that's the stereotype. The husband is just the forgiving, suave guy who says, well, don't worry, honey, you can't burn the beer. Bye, Schlitz. So these stereotypes are offensive, and they continue to show up, and sometimes other groups are stereotyped too. Believe it or not, white middle-aged men are stereotyped too, often in content, not commercials, as being the sort of the bumbling guys who can't get anything straight. But it's more common to see these stereotypes and these other offensive things applied to Black Americans or African Americans, women, and in some cases children too. So I want to talk about one of the campaigns that was launched back in the 70s by an airline, National. And this was one of a lot of different ads that were similar, and they were intended to play on the stereotype of the sexy stewardess. And so they all had big headlines that said, I'm Joe, fly me. Obviously you're supposed to imagine that in a sultry, seductive voice. And then the copy reads, you've met my friend Cheryl and some more friends, Karen, Laura, Margie, Pat, Undra, and Ann. And you've flown them to New York, Miami, Los Angeles, San Francisco, even London. So this is intended to get the sophisticated male business traveler aroused to want to pay attention to these ads, and they came out, a series of them came out one after the other. And it wasn't until really that the National Organization for Women, which is called, the acronym is NOW, started protesting these types of ads in the early 1970s that people started paying a little more attention to that. Now, do advertisers still stereotype women as being, in order to sell a product, they have to be sexy and hot and all that kind of stuff? Sure. Are men still portrayed in certain ways? Yes. Stereotypes are one of the things that the advertising industry relies on to help sell products. It doesn't have to be that way if you find that offensive. And that's just, I wanted to show you some examples here to show you what the chapter is talking about partly, but also to show you that this wasn't all that long ago. I mean, the 70s may be a long time ago for some of you, but it's really not that far in our country's past, and we're still seeing this kind of problems today. So there has been some improvement in representations of minorities and women in advertising since the 70s, but now it's more a sin of omission than commission. So I went and found some ads that obviously portrayed mostly white guys and white children. There is a stereotypical mom and daughter in there on the iPad ad, but this is not to say that there aren't stereotypical ads of women for perfume products and for clothing and things, restaurants and things like that. But a lot of times what we see in advertising stereotypes is not that that blatant Aunt Jemima style stereotype, we just see that a lot of black Americans aren't used in advertising, just as they're often not used in movies. They're not often used on certain television shows and things like that. So one of the ways to, quote, solve the problem is to avoid the problem. And that's what I mean by a sin of omission rather than committing a sin. Now, feel free to disagree with this. I'm not trying to take a political stance here. I'm simply pointing out what has been pointed out by many, many, many other ordinary average people like you and experts, is that this is a real issue for advertising. Is how do they fairly represent the people in our country? And so I'm not trying to stir up an issue here. I'm just simply saying that this is something really controversial that people talk about. Advertising to children is something else that critics have been for decades charging that advertisers create harmful advertising for children. They target children and take advantage of them because of primarily all the time that children spend watching TV. I did some independent research to verify this, but it's true that many children under the age of 7 or 8 still can't always distinguish between fantasy and reality. So if they see something portrayed in an advertisement or in the content of a program, obviously, they may very well think that it's real up to a certain age. And when you see how many ads feature high-priced toys or junk food, super sweet cereals and things like that, it's no doubt one of the contributing factors that children get exposed to this sort of stuff so very early and so much that this is what they grow up believing. In fact, children and adolescents, I found through my research, view more than 40,000 ads per year on TV alone. Now, I personally don't have a way to verify that, but it's a statement from an expert that I found. I wanted to include it in the slideshow because I was curious, and whether or not that figure is accurate or not, it seems high to me, but it still shows you the tremendous influence that advertising has on children for good and for bad. And I'm talking a little bit about some of the bad effects of advertising on children. And there's still little to no regulation on advertising to children to this day, unless it just becomes patently offensive, unless there's nudity, unless there's some other things that nobody would want children to be exposed to. Very little is done to regulate the content of advertising to children and the format and the kind of the way they do it with, high excitement, high velocity type graphics and colors and very loud voiceovers and splashy images and things like that. In fact, that's one of the reasons why over the course of many years of teaching college, I've encountered a fair number of students who were homeschooled. And part of the reason is their parents didn't want them exposed to that onslaught of advertising or to much of the mass media in general. You may be one of those people. I don't know. Now, obviously, there are some positive effects of advertising, and there are many discussed in the chapter, and you can find them also in libraries and online and the internet. But since Blog 4, which you're supposed to be doing right about now, is about that topic, I'm going to hold off on providing my thoughts here. You can read something about the positive effects of advertising in the chapter, and I will wait to read your blogs to see how you answer this question about how advertising can be made more positive. So I'm going to push some of that information gathering off on you. So that's part 2 of Chapter 12. We'll be back with the last part pretty soon.